Hello everyone, the Skilled Roy here, back with another Legends of Runeterra video, and today we have a bunch of custom cards to review, this time of Renata Glasc by Taptricity. These cards are some really cool cards, introducing as well a new keyword, so let's hop right in and see how they did. Alright, as always though, we'll start with the new keyword, and the new keyword is Deal Maker. You can use spell mana to play me, but activate my Deal Maker effect. So either you play it normally and don't have to activate the Deal Maker effect, or you can use spell mana to play them and also have to activate their Deal Maker effect. So generally how this is phrased, it looks like it's going to be a bunch of downsides, which will enable you to sort of accelerate yourself with the spell mana, but you do have to pay a cost, aka make a deal. So let's go ahead and see what these cards have to offer. Alright, so the first card we have up is the 2-mana 2/2 Shady Entrepreneur. Play, manifest a fast spell from the regions you can afford, and Deal Maker, deal 2 to your Nexus. So obviously the very simple comparison here is going to be Pharaoh's Financier, as well as Conchologist. Two cards that are both very good in their respective decks. Obviously, in most situations, Conchologist is generally seen as the much more powerful option out of the two, and it's played in almost any deck that can run Bandle City. And this card is doing something similar with manifesting a fast spell from your regions, but it also has the possible option of paying 2 life essentially and using your spell mana instead, effectively allowing you to ramp yourself a bit. This is especially powerful because of cards like Forge Chief, a card that will allow you to sort of ramp your mana as well as develop your board at the same time, essentially meaning that you can now pay life to extend your advantage on the board a bit further. Now, I think the number one question here is to sort of ask yourself on this is that if this card is at minimum roughly equivalent to 2 already solid cards, does the Deal Maker effect, is it punishing enough to sort of have that versatility on and off? And honestly, while I do believe that the cost is pretty significant, much more significant than it might appear at first glance, it's important to note that if you just ignore the Deal Maker mechanic here, it is still an extremely solid card on its own. And because of that, I can't help but feel that, like, perhaps in a card pool that has almost entirely answers such as Mystic Shot, Get Excited, some Fumes, etc., I kind of feel like the body itself should probably have to pay some sort of premium when you're already as good as some other cards that already exist in the game that are already seeing play. So to me, I feel like the design is really cool and I like the concept so far, and I do like how Deal Maker is used here. I do kind of feel like it's a little pushed though when it's worst case scenario, aka when you're ignoring its effect. It is still an obviously competitive card thanks to cards you've already seen in the game. So I do think that for that versatility, it should pay for a little bit in stats, probably as like a 1/2 or a 2/1, but honestly, I'm kind of just nitpicking here, and that really depends on how pushed you want the archetype to be. So overall though, I think Shady Entrepreneur is a well-designed card. I'm going to give it a 4 out of 5 for design, and for execution, I do think it missteps a little bit on balance, so I am going to be giving it a 3 for execution. Next up we have the Glasc Factory Worker, a 3-mana with Strike. If you spent any spell mana this round, draw 1. And then of course Deal Maker, set my stats to 2/1 this round. This is a really interesting sort of card, so you can obviously accelerate them out as early as turn 2, but if you do that, you are having to then therefore have only a 2/1 body for the turn that you play them, both hurting your defensive turn if you're trying to play it defensively, as well as your aggressive turn if you're trying to use this to get out ahead and use yourself to sort of get extra bodies on the board, because that means something as small as like a Group Shot or a Vile Feast can then stop your strike and therefore stop your draw. This is actually quite interesting in terms of how the card works overall. I think it's pretty neat, and obviously the comparisons here are going to be to cards like River Shaper, a card that is a 3-mana 2/2 by default but will always draw spells. Now, this obviously has a condition on top of that where you have to spend mana to actually get that effect, and sure, while you can get it out sooner, and it does play into its own strike effect because of that, you are putting yourself at a greater risk. So I think it's actually not too bad of a card in that respect. And it probably is a little too good at 3/3, maybe a little too good, but honestly I think it's fine as it's pushed right now. And overall, a really neat card. I'm a big fan of this card overall. I think I'm going to give the design a solid like 4 out of 5 for this one as well. And for execution, I think it's actually really nice. I like the card a lot. I'm going to give it a 4 in execution as well. All right, next we have Handshake, based off of Renata's grab in League. It is a 3-mana slow speed spell. Deal 3 damage to anything. If your spell mana is full, I accelerate to fast. Now, this card might seem a little balanced, but I do want to point out a couple things here. First things first, Decimate is a 5 mana card that deals 4 damage, and it is consistently one of the best cards in a burn deck. And sometimes even in the previous burn decks that use Noxus and P&Z, a lot of those decks would also actually run Aftershock, a 4 mana to deal 3 damage slow speed spell. Now, we didn't run that card because of the tons of landmarks or banditry or anything like that. That was a nice bonus. But we just ran it because we can't actually put 4 copies of Decimate into our deck, so we'll run worse Decimate. Now, my concern here with Handshake is that it's a 3 mana deal 3 to anything. I'm not even reading the rest of the card here, and a 3 mana, even at slow speed, to deal 3 damage to anything, that is only 2 less mana for 1 less damage on a Decimate to the enemy's face, or it can be used as removal in a pinch. Now, adding the fact that it can also accelerate up to fast speed as long as it's your first spell that turn, essentially, it can get really spooky really quickly, especially with what I like to sort of call critical mass. Now, while this card might be balanced on its own, the sheer number of burn spells that exist between P&Z and Noxus, you have to be very careful about what you print now. That's actually why a lot of the more recent burn spells, such as Sump Fumes, actually specifically do not allow you to target face, because eventually, once you have enough cards that deal damage to face at a relatively efficient mana cost ratio, you're going to be able to start burn spelling the opponent from your full hand, and you can actually just race them down in a way that most decks can't really interact with. And so while I do think Handshake could be balanced in many ways, I do kind of also feel that, like, it could be the tipping point. It could be the straw that breaks the camel's back on the burn decks, you know what I mean? I think I would give this card a solid 3 in design. It's pretty harmless from a design standpoint anyways, but I am going to give it a 2 in execution. I just feel as though this card is just a little bit too much and doesn't really factor in the surrounding cards around it too much here, right? Overall, though, it's a neat idea. I just think that it probably should be no longer be able to target face. That feels like a bit too much for me for this card. Okay, next up we have the 5 mana 4/3 Glasc Middle Manager. When I'm summoned, the next spell you cast this round that targets an enemy is casted again on the same targets. Dealmaker, you can only cast 1 more spell this round. So this is actually quite interesting. What is the best way to abuse this? Obviously, it can't be things that automatically target or AoEs, because in those situations they won't target and therefore won't fulfill the conditions. I'm trying to think, is the best solution really just going to be things like Mystic Shot or a Thermo Beam to like get a huge amount of damage while developing a board? It does kind of feel like that is the main sort of solution for it, and overall I think it's pretty neat in those respects. I do like these pseudo combo cards, and just like how kegs are like one-time damage bonuses, I would like there to be like one-time spell multiplication, especially when it's being limited in a safe way, like you have to target something, like therefore stopping you from doing crazy stuff like drawing 30 cards or stuff like that. I do think probably what's going to end up happening for Glasc Middle Manager here is you're going to be using this with Pokey Stick the most. Like, that just seems like the most logical one. Being able to do essentially a Mystic Shot, draw 2 is extremely good, and the fact that it has Dealmaker on this card and its downside, which is you can only cast 1 more spell this round, it kind of doesn't matter when you're getting that much value that quickly. All it really does is ensure that you have to plan your mana out a bit more ahead of time, which that's a welcome thing to have for sure, and I agree on that, but it definitely does feel like a bit of a non-condition, because in most situations, you're going to be playing Glasc Middle Manager in a situation where you're going to want to maximize your return on the spell you cast next anyways, which will typically be you casting the most mana possible, right? The downside here isn't going to be super relevant in most situations, and it feels less like a deck building constraint and rather than just like a small safety valve. And while I do appreciate the existence of a small safety valve, I can't help but be like, well, it doesn't really seem to warrant any sort of real like thought on whether or not you're doing the deal or not. There's never going to be a time where you're going to be like, ah, yes, I want to play Glasc Middle Manager and then not combo out. You know what I mean? In most situations, especially in burn decks, for example, you're just going to play it out and then just blow them up with like 6 damage from Get Exciteds, right? You don't really care that the mana is being left over because you can just cast that before the Glasc Middle Manager and then go from there, you know? And I do think there's a bit more of a concern in those respects. Not to mention, I just think the card is good even without the Dealmaker. You don't really need to accelerate it. You can just play it on the board, not worry about the downside, and save that spell mana for the spell you're going to be casting anyways. So this one definitely does feel a little confused, I think, because unlike some of the other cards that we looked at so far, the Dealmaker here doesn't really feel like a deal. It feels very one-sided, if I'm being quite honest. So overall, I'm not a huge fan of the deal maker on this card, but I do like the concept and the idea, and honestly the balance of everything else on this card. Overall, it was a pretty solid card. I think overall design, I'm going to give it a 4 in design. I just really wish the deal maker was something different here. I don't really feel the constraints of it too much here. And as for the execution, I think it's a solid 4 as well. Really solid execution on the concept. I could see some nerfs to it if you really needed to, but I do like the idea a lot. I think it's really cool, and I think the balance is actually pretty close to where I want to put it. All right, next up is Leverage. Leverage is a 1 mana spell. If you spent any spell mana this round, manifest a damage spell from your regions that costs 3 or less. Now, normally, I think a 1 mana spell that just let you look for damage spell for 3 or less would be a little too strong for me. It allows you to run essentially a 4th copy of Mystic Shot, or say Get Excited, because again it's from your regions and that's something that's typically be a damage spell that costs 3 or less. I think the spookiest way this card can really be run though is you're going to run this with and looking for Thermal Beam. Getting Thermal Beam off of this is going to feel great. It's something that a lot of P&Z control decks would really love to have, be able to quickly search for whichever they need. They can either be looking for damage, they could damage to the face, they could be looking for a Thermal Beam to control the board, they could look for AoE. Like, there's a lot of good solid options here that I think are really decent. Now, this is actually Renata's champion spell, and I don't want to spoil that just yet because we're going to review that, but she also has Deal Maker, so that's going to also be another way to sort of activate your leverage and do some more stuff off of it. We're going to see how well and nicely it actually combines together. Overall, Leverage is a really solid toolbox card, and I can see it being, like, honestly pretty great, especially considering how good most damage spells are, especially in the 3 or less range. Most notably, again, Thermal Beam. So I think the design of this card is pretty good. I'm going to give this actually a 5 in design. I think it's a really solid card. This card is just makes a lot of sense to me, and I think it's really good. Execution-wise, there's a couple things I could hypothetically say. I think the requirement is really solid and it's well made there. I'm always scared about adding a card that allows you to look for both Thermal Beam and Get Excited with minimal cost, especially in like a control deck, or especially in a deck like, say, like old school Thermal Beam decks that can really just sort of just pile on a bunch of burn damage out of nowhere. And the ability to be able to search for any of it at any time just gets a little scary for me. So I'm going to give it a hesitant 4 here. I think it's actually pretty decently designed as well, but I am just scared of how much burn can we keep fitting into P&Z, especially since how easy it is, since it'll always be getting you at least something that can do damage, right? All right, here she is, Renata herself, the 4 mana 4/3 with quick attack. Attack, when I attack strike, refill 2 spell mana. And then Deal Maker, to play me, I strike an ally or your Nexus. The level up is you've spent 8+ spell mana. When she levels up, she gets she then changes to have when I'm summoned or at round start, create a hostile takeover in hand, and then the same effects as before, but then hostile takeover is a spell for 2 mana that says an enemy that has power less than or equal to the amount of mana you spent last round strikes the enemy Nexus. Really, really cool, flavorful way to sort of bring in her making people attack themselves or attack their allies from her League of Legends kit. Honestly, really solid package here across the board, so let's take things step at a time though. Let's start with the level 1. The level 1, having the ability to strike an ally or your Nexus, is interesting and it's flavorful to her character already, and then once she's on the board, she can then attack and get in and start refilling your spell mana. What's important to note here though is that Deal Maker and her mana cost are put in such a way where it's fairly difficult to be able to play her before turn 3. Essentially meaning she can only really accelerate herself by 1 turn before you get too scared of things like a turn 2 Renata coming down and just absolutely destroying things. Even with things like Forge Chief, if you were to say play Forge Chief on turn 1, attack, you still aren't going to be able to get Renata in time unless the opponent willfully attacks into you on the 2nd turn, and then you just keep going from there. That's the one situation where that happens. And honestly, if my opponent is playing Renata Glasc and they play Forge Chief, I'm not going to give them the 4th mana they need to play Renata on turn 2. I think that's just common sense, and I think that's a pretty fair thing to note. Overall though, the card is really neat. I know it'd be overpowered. But I would love if that attack effect worked on any strike, just because I'm a crazy person and I would love it so that I could play it, boom, kill my ally, or strike my Nexus, and then get my spell mana back, and then I can make another deal with another Deal Maker card in my hand. That feels a lot more resonant to me, and I wonder if there's a way to balance this card to make that a reality while chopping off some power from other parts of her kit. I think that's the issue here, is that she's really, really powerful already, so you can't really have that cool synergy piece, and I would really love that. Now, full disclosure, that is very much a personal thing of me that I'm just like, man, I would love to do dumb stuff in a card game, you know? That's definitely not like healthy, but I would love it personally. And then when you level her up, she then sort of adds in this sort of inevitability machine where she's going to keep getting these hostile takeovers and essentially force the opponent to kind of just die from their own units as you keep building up a board. And since it's based on how much mana you spent, you're going to be developing your own board, using your own burn spells, and you're basically going to be scaring the opponent into taking the damage. So I think I respect that in some angles. I'm always looking for ways to trim text off of cards to make things more clean, make things more simple, because if you look at the level 2 Renata, for example, she kind of has 3 abilities, and while most of the time they aren't really relevant for her to have all 3 abilities, and certainly we've had cards in the past that have just a bunch of abilities stapled on top of each other, I think that this one definitely feels like pushing the upper limits. I wonder if there's a better way to like write any of these effects in such a way that it can make things a bit better overall. But yeah, that's my general opinion there. All in all, Renata is a really, really cool card that sort of has a really unique sort of gameplay with Dealmaker that sort of lets you do all sorts of cool tempo plays. I really like how Renata both refills her own spell mana back up so you can make a second deal that turn, as well as do some really interesting possible things with paying your own life or sacrificing your own units to get an advantage in tempo. Honestly, the card is really well designed, and I think that as a sort of top-end curve here, it makes a lot of sense too. I'm also a huge fan of how spending 8 spell mana isn't locked to the Dealmaker mechanic. It's not like, hey, you must make 5 deals or you must make 4 deals. It's instead locked to casting spells at all, which you're going to want to do with her, and it's open enough that you can play it in a variety of different decks, from a control to tempo to maybe even an aggro burn deck in some level. But overall, I think the design of the card is pretty solid. Like, I don't really have anything to say other than like nitpicky, like, hey, it should probably cut down on the text and maybe there's more cooler ways to do the effect. But other than that, though, I think it's a really solid direction, and I would love to see a second deal maker that was like a champion pair for Renata, because this is like a really solid foundation with her and her followers right here. I think overall, I'm going to give Renata a solid 4 for design. I think it's really cool, but overall for me, I think I would like to see it pushed just a bit more into the creativity side. I do love it a lot, though, as is, though. I want to make sure that's absolutely clear. As for the execution, I think the balance is honestly pretty good. I was more concerned about some of the followers and spells that were associated with Renata than her herself. I think there's definitely an argument you could say about the templating and how cumbersome Attack Strike is. Even with Ari, it's already kind of cumbersome, but that's you can't blame Tap for doing that, considering it's already in the game. So I think I'm actually going to give this, I think I'm going to give it a 5 in execution, actually. Like, I don't really have any balance problems with the card. The ideas behind it are really solid, and all the numbers and templating and even the flavor feels really, really good for this card. So honestly, I don't really have any sort of critique on the execution angle. I think the card's really great. Really solid execution on the card. And that brings my review to a close. Thank you again so much to Tap for submitting this amazing Renata set. I was a huge fan of it. Really, really cool cards. If you guys want to leave your own feedback and criticisms for this card, please leave them in the comments below. Or of course, come check us out on the Custom LOR Discord, where we talk all about custom cards all the time and sort of design some really cool ideas for Legends of Runeterra as a whole. And hey, if you want to support me, I would really appreciate a like and a subscribe. You know, I gotta do it. It's the YouTube thing I gotta do. You know how it is. But anyways, though, that'll be it for me. Thank you so much, everyone, for watching. I will see you all next time. Peace out.